In the town of Ashworth, England, December 1965, 6 people vanished without a trace. No screams, no struggle, just silence. But when investigators finally entered their home, they found something that would haunt them forever. A house frozen in time, meals half-eaten, and a child's drawing of 6 figures standing around a spiral. One figure was upside down. What happened to the Higgins family wasn't a simple disappearance. It was the culmination of a centuries-old ritual that an entire village kept hidden. This is their story. The morning of December 8th, milkman John Leary noticed something odd at the Higgins' doorstep. 4 bottles of milk sat untouched, frost clinging to the glass. No empty bottles returned, no footprints in the snow. By midday, neighbors exchanged worried glances over garden fences. By nightfall, a constable stood inside their home, torch trembling in his hands. Everything looked disturbingly normal. Beds slept in, but never made. A casserole dish sat cold on the counter, half-eaten, covered loosely with foil. The radio hummed static in the corner. Margaret's knitting sat mid-row on the armrest. The Sunday paper lay open to the crossword. But the family, all 6 of them, were gone. No signs of struggle, no luggage missing, no goodbye. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong. The walls seemed too close. The air smelled like damp stone, though the fire had been lit just yesterday. And on the hallway mirror, someone had drawn a crude spiral in the condensation, left untouched. It wasn't just the vanishing that disturbed the village. It was what people began to remember afterward. The strange things the Higgins family had said, the odd symbols chalked near their doorstep, the way the children stopped making eye contact, the midnight lights in the church. The diary was found tucked behind a loose floorboard in the eldest daughter's bedroom. Lydia Higgins, age 14, faded green leather, cracked along the spine. Her name was inked on the inside cover, alongside a childish drawing of the family cottage. But what lay inside was no ordinary teenage rambling. The first few pages were harmless. Mentions of school, her younger brother's tantrums, how cold the village had been that autumn. But as the entries moved closer to December, the tone changed. They grew scattered, paranoid, afraid. Mom won't stop whispering to herself in the garden. She thinks I'm asleep, but I saw her draw a circle in the soil. Just stood there in the cold, didn't move for an hour. Father keeps locking the cellar door. He says it's damp, but I heard voices coming from down there. It's not the pipes. And then an entry dated just 5 days before the family vanished. I asked Reverend Clark why we don't celebrate Christmas anymore. He looked straight through me and said, "Some gifts come with a cost, child. Best to be thankful." In silence, I don't like his eyes. Tucked between those final pages was a torn scrap of paper, a drawing, obviously done by a child, of 6 stick figures standing around a large spiral. One of the figures was upside down. Above them, hanging in the sky like a dark sun, was a symbol none of the local police could identify, not at first. What made the drawing more disturbing was what was written on the back, scrawled in what appeared to be red pencil, in a hand far less stable than Lydia's. "They chose us." At first, the local constable dismissed it as the disturbed mind of a teenage girl. But the lead investigator, Sergeant Len Henley, wasn't convinced. He'd seen symbols like that spiral before, during a training course with Scotland Yard, in a unit that studied historical occult behavior. It wasn't just a spiral, it was a protection ward, twisted from ancient British folklore, often associated with sacrificial rituals, meant to cleanse a community. But who had Lydia been drawing with? And what had the family been chosen for? The deeper Sergeant Henley dug, the more the village resisted. Ashworth wasn't the sort of place that welcomed questions, especially not from outsiders. People stopped answering their doors. The vicar went on sudden sabbatical. Neighbors who had known the Higginses for decades suddenly claimed they barely interacted. There was fear in their silence, fear and guilt. If you ask anyone over the age of 60 in Ashworth about Reverend Clark, they'll lower their voice or change the subject entirely. Tall, gentle-spoken, and immaculately dressed, Reverend Malcolm Clark served St. Mary's for over 25 years. To an outsider, he was the image of quiet country clergy, but there was something about him that felt rehearsed. His smile never reached his eyes, and he rarely blinked. He arrived in Ashworth in 1940, just before the end of the war. No one remembers where he came from. His papers were clean, his references were vague, but he was kind to the children and spoke softly from the pulpit, quoting obscure scripture and weaving in lessons about sacrifice, order, and removing rot from the garden of God. The congregation nodded along. Most didn't really listen until around 1951, when something shifted. Church attendance dropped suddenly. Those who did still attend described the sermons as unsettling. A handful of families left the village entirely. No announcement, no forwarding address. Clark stopped using the traditional Bible and began reading from a worn black leather-bound text with no visible title. When questioned, he would smile and say, "It's older than you know." A purer truth. One parishioner, Agnes Barlow, now 91 and living in a care home in Yorkshire, recalled a sermon just 2 years before the Higginses vanished. He spoke of blood and birthright, said the village had gone soft, that we needed to wake the stone beneath us. Everyone just sat there, nodding. I looked around and thought, am I the only one who hears how mad this is? But no one challenged Clark, not publicly, not ever. And then there were the special services, held once every season, always at night, always by invitation only. Lights off, doors locked, chants could be heard through the heavy wood, but no one admitted to attending. When villagers were asked, even years later, they denied everything, or said they were out of town, or simply stared back and said, "Some things are best left alone." Sergeant Henley tried to interview Clark, drove out to the vicarage himself, but when he arrived, the Reverend was gone. The study had been emptied, records burned in the fireplace, pews in the chapel overturned. A circle of ash marked the altar. Whatever was kept there, whatever had been read there, was gone. Clark had vanished, just like the Higginses, except one thing remained. Etched into the inside of the chapel door, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "The offering is complete, the gate will hold." St. Mary's Church stood like a stone sentinel at the edge of Ashworth, weather-beaten and ivy-covered. It had watched over the village for centuries. Most believed it was built in the 1700s, but Sergeant Henley's investigation revealed something far older. Beneath Its foundations, a small maintenance hatch behind the altar, hidden behind stacked hymnals and false paneling, led to a steep spiral staircase. Dust coated every surface, and the air was damp, metallic, almost sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with rust. At the bottom was a door, oak reinforced, ancient. Someone had scratched deep grooves into the wood, as if clawing to get out. When the forensic team forced it open, what they found defied logic. The chamber was circular, no more than 20 feet across, lit only by natural cracks in the stone ceiling above. In the center, embedded into the floor, was a shallow basin, blackened by something long soaked in. On the walls were carvings, symbols, spirals, eyes, repeating motifs of hands held open and mouths stitched shut. But what truly stopped the investigators cold were the personal items. Laid out around the basin were children's toys, handmade dolls, worn shoes, a set of wooden teeth, a baby's bonnet stained dark, and one item that made Sergeant Henley leave the room, a hand-sewn patch bearing the initials LH, stitched in blue. Lydia Higgins. DNA testing later confirmed that several of the items belonged to the Higgins children. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. There were dozens of items, and they didn't all belong to the Higgins family. Local police began re-examining cold cases, and slowly a terrifying picture emerged. Ashworth had a history of missing persons stretching back decades. Most were dismissed at the time as vagrants, runaways, drifters passing through. But now, in the cold light of forensic science, many of these cases were linked by one shared detail. They had all vanished within a 2-mile radius of St. Mary's Church, and the chamber, it had no known architectural record. Not even the diocese had it on file. Some experts speculated it dated back to pre-Christian times, a chalk cult site, possibly repurposed by early settlers, then later by the church, but its purpose remained unclear. That is, until they found the ledger, bound in human skin, confirmed via analysis. The small book was hidden in a bricked alcove behind a basin, written in a language that linguists struggled to identify. Parts were eventually translated. It contained dates, names, ritual instructions, and most chilling of all, a recurring phrase, "We give so the soil stays still." After the discovery beneath St. Mary's, Sergeant Henley focused his attention on the town's power structure, specifically the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society. To outsiders, it was a harmless, elderly-run group that organized flower shows and helped maintain old buildings. They hosted bake sales, ran the village fete, and produced a yearly heritage booklet. But Henley found something disturbing in their records, or rather, in what wasn't recorded. There were no founding documents, no bank trail before 1962, no clear explanation as to who officially ran it, and yet it owned almost half the properties in Ashworth. Manor homes, farmland, even St. Mary's Church, all listed under shell names connected to the society. Members included the local doctor, headmistress, bank manager, and perhaps most disturbingly, former Chief Constable Reginald Vaughan, who had once been Henley's superior. It was Vaughan's quiet retirement, following his refusal to investigate the Higgins disappearance further, that had first raised Henley's suspicions. Now it made sense. Henley obtained an anonymous tip, pointing him to the society's private archive room, hidden beneath the town library. With a warrant and a trusted team, he entered the space just after midnight. What they uncovered shook even the most hardened officers. Over 50 boxes of handwritten records, many in Latin and Old English, catalogued names, dates, rituals, and something called the tithe of the soil. Each decade, an offering was required. Not always a person, sometimes livestock, but increasingly from 1924 onwards, the entries turned darker. Children, always from outside the bloodline. One document, dated 1965, the year the Higgins family vanished, read, "The soil beneath St. Mary's trembles, the harvest weakens. A full family shall be returned to the root, blooded and bound." But it wasn't just text, there were photographs. One black and white image showed Reverend Clark in ceremonial robes, standing beside what appeared to be a wooden altar. In the background, the Higgins twins, eyes vacant, hands bound. Another showed a group of 12 people, all in formal wear, faces solemn, standing around an open stone basin. Several were recognizable. Others bore a terrifying resemblance to known Ashworth families still living there. The society wasn't just involved, they were running the entire show from within the respectable heart of the village. Behind lace curtains and charity work, a hidden council had maintained control for decades, enforcing rituals that dated back to before the Norman conquest, and every single one of them had sworn an oath. "We preserve so the ground stays quiet." Sergeant Henley knew what he was stepping into. In a village like Ashworth, you don't go digging into your neighbors unless you're prepared for what might crawl out. After the archive discovery, he requested immediate backup from county authorities, but his requests were mysteriously delayed repeatedly. He later learned the files he submitted had been flagged and held under pending verification. Someone higher up was slowing things down. So Henley did something no one expected. He went public. He contacted a regional journalist, a woman named Claire Merrick, known for her fearless reporting on rural corruption. He shared photographs, ledger translations, and even recordings of his interviews with past Ashworth residents who'd fled the village over the years. Many spoke of strange church gatherings, unexplained disappearances, and a suffocating silence that blanketed anyone who asked too many questions. Within 48 hours, Claire's article hit the front page of the Yorkshire Sentinel under the headline, "The Rituals of Ashworth. Did a village hide a century of sacrifice?" It exploded. National media latched onto the story. Television crews descended on the village. The church was sealed off, and within days, villagers began whispering names, people they'd always found off, stories they'd heard but never dared speak aloud. That's when Henley's life turned. His car was vandalized. His wife received an anonymous note reading, "The roots are deep, and so is your grave." He was suspended from duty, pending a formal review, but the attention was now too great to bury. A public inquiry was opened. Survivors came forward, one by one. Former members of the Preservation Society were brought in for questioning. Then came the break. A man in his 80s, Edwin Marlowe, confessed. Once the village undertaker He had witnessed the 1965 ritual. He described in chilling detail how the Higgins family had been prepared, dressed in white linen, and led to the underground chamber. But his most disturbing revelation: the sacrifice had not been the first, nor the last. Every decade, he said, voice trembling, we gave them to the ground. Families, orphans, foundlings, always chosen, always agreed upon. And we were told if we stopped, the land would rot and death would come tenfold. His confession triggered a series of arrests. Vaughn, Clark, and several other prominent figures were charged with conspiracy, ritual murder, and obstruction of justice, but most of them died. Some by suicide, others under suspicious natural circumstances. Before the trials began, still, Henley's work cracked the wall of silence. The press called it the Ashworth Pact. For the first time, the truth had a voice. As media interest intensified and public horror grew, historians and occult scholars descended on Ashworth, eager to uncover the deeper origins of the so-called Preservation Society. What they found sent ripples through both academic and law enforcement communities. Ashworth, it turned out, was never an ordinary village. It was built on a boundary, not just between counties, but between pagan and Christian Britain. Long before churches were erected, the land had been home to an ancient Druidic settlement, known in pre-Roman records as Ashworth, meaning the place of the ash sacrifice. The name had changed over centuries, but the rituals hadn't. Deep beneath the current church, beneath even the chamber where the Higgins family was taken, archaeologists discovered a much older stone structure, carbon dated to over 1,000 years ago. At its center was a circular stone table, blackened by centuries of soot, surrounded by crude carvings of trees, roots, and chained human figures. It wasn't a church, it was a temple. Records found in a nearby manor house, written in early Middle English, told of a pact made between village elders and a keeper beneath the soil, a force believed to protect the land from blight, plague, and war, in exchange for offerings. These offerings were originally animals, but after the Black Death swept through Britain in the 14th century, the pact was rewritten. The land must drink that which thinks. One entry read, "In blood of kin and stranger shall the soil know peace." Even after the village Christianized, the tradition endured, but went underground. The Preservation Society, it turned out, was only the latest name for a long line of secret orders tasked with maintaining the ritual. From 1437 to the present day, the names had changed, but the purpose remained chillingly consistent. Keep Ashworth quiet, keep the land fed, keep outsiders blind. What shook investigators most was just how institutionalized this system had become. Each generation trained the next. Births, adoptions, marriages, all were influenced by the society, ensuring loyalty through blood and fear. And those who resisted, they simply vanished. At first glance, the Higgins family seemed like victims of random fate, outsiders who stumbled into a place they never truly belonged. But as investigators traced their arrival in Ashworth, a chilling pattern began to emerge. They weren't just chosen, they were invited. According to land records from 1962, the family moved into a cottage owned by the church, not the council, leased directly to them by Reverend Clark himself. For a token amount, even stranger, the position offered to Edward Higgins, a supposed groundskeeper post at St. Mary's Church, had never been publicly listed. He was offered the job by name. Digging deeper, Sergeant Henley found adoption files for the Higgins' two younger children, files that were altered, redacted, and ultimately traced back to an agency connected to a long-defunct Catholic orphanage in Sussex. The trail ran cold until a retired administrator came forward anonymously. She confirmed that the Higgins adopted children were part of a selective placement initiative run quietly in the 1950s and 60s, where certain families were matched with children of particular temperament and background for small rural communities. On paper, it sounded benign, even charitable, but what she described next was anything but. There was a list, she said, an internal list with villages flagged as preservation zones. If you saw one of those names, Ashworth, Hartmore, Grendale, it meant the child's placement wasn't just about home and care, it was about purpose. That purpose, to quietly deliver certain children into communities that still followed the old ways. Suddenly, the pieces clicked. The Higgins family, with their mix of biological and adopted children, their isolation from extended relatives, their eager involvement with the church, they weren't just ideal sacrifices, they were deliberately constructed to be sacrifices. This revelation horrified even the most hardened investigators. It suggested multi-agency collusion, church, state, and orphanage systems working together to fulfill the needs of communities like Ashworth, all under the guise of faith and charity. By August 1965, something had shifted inside the Higgins household. Neighbors described it as a cloud passing over their cottage. Smiles turned strained. Church attendance became erratic. The youngest daughter, 8-year-old Eliza, was seen weeping on the church steps after Sunday service. When Mrs. Cartwright, their closest neighbor, asked what was wrong, the girl whispered, "They're coming for us. Daddy knows." What followed were a series of increasingly bizarre sightings. Edward Higgins was seen digging behind the church late at night, unearthing something before quickly covering it again. Two of the older boys were spotted burning family photo albums. In the garden, Mary Higgins, once the heart of Ashworth's women's group, began appearing at community meetings with bruises on her arms and vacant eyes, speaking only when spoken to. Then there was the journal, hidden in the base of a wooden toy chest, discovered years later during a forensic sweep of their abandoned home. Though many pages were damaged by time and damp, a few remained intact. They were written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, and the entries, presumably by Edward, grew darker by the day. They lied. This was never about faith. The prayers are old, older than the Bible. Mary says we have to play along, but I see it in their eyes. They've chosen us. The children are having the dreams again. Eliza screams in her sleep. James says a man in robes comes to the window. I told them it's just a nightmare, but I've seen him too. It's not just the church, it's the schoolmaster, the baker, even the constable. I trusted these people. The most disturbing entry came just 5 days before the family vanished. They've warned us. The last offering failed. If we don't comply, it will be worse. I asked Mary if she'd run. She shook her head and said, "It's already too late." "I don't know what to do, but I buried the first one deep." That last sentence would haunt investigators for years. What or who was he referring to? Police excavations later uncovered a small skeleton wrapped in cloth behind the church garden. Just as witnesses had described, the remains belonged to a child, female, age estimated at 3 or 4. There were no missing children reported in Ashworth from that time, which raised an even more terrifying possibility. Was this not the first sacrifice involving the Higgins family? Had they been involved, unwillingly or not, in earlier rituals, perhaps manipulated into believing it would spare them? September 3, 1965. Ashworth's annual harvest vigil was meant to be a quaint rural affair, held under the old oak trees near St. Mary's Church. It combined hymns, cider, and stories of gratitude for the year's yield. But that year, it felt off. The air was unusually still. The trees didn't move, and the Higgins family, for the first time in months, arrived together. Witnesses would later recall their appearance with unease. Mary in a gray shawl, eyes sunken and blank. Edward, gaunt and silent, gripping a child on either side. The children wore identical linen garments, odd considering the chilly air, and none of them spoke, not once. The entire village attended, even those who rarely came out. But this wasn't just a vigil. This was something older. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the Reverend took the podium, but instead of his usual sermon on gratitude, he opened a weathered black book, not the Bible, and began reading in a language no one could quite place. Low rhythmic chanting followed, then humming, and then silence. A circle formed. The Higgins children were ushered forward, calmly, obediently, like they had practiced it. Mary stood still. Edward looked as though he might speak, but didn't. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the woods behind the church, a long, haunted look that would be his last, because moments later, the candles were blown out. What happened next has been pieced together from the only surviving witness, a 14-year-old boy named Samuel Lawn, who had hidden beneath one of the cider carts after being dared by schoolmates. He saw everything. According to Samuel, once the candles went out, the crowd began chanting again, louder this time. Then came the bells, but not from the chapel. These were deep, metallic tolls coming from somewhere beneath the earth, the kind you feel more than hear, through gaps in the wooden slats. Samuel saw the children being led in pairs toward the church's rear entrance, not through the doors, but around the back, where the old root cellar lay hidden beneath ivy and stone. He watched as Edward hesitated, looked back toward Mary, and then vanished behind the church wall. And that was the last time the Higgins family was seen alive. By morning, the entire family, mother, father, and all 4 children, were gone. The official explanation: they moved. No forwarding address, no questions asked. But Samuel never forgot what he saw, and as he grew older, he began documenting it all. Drawings, notes, maps, until decades later, he handed it to someone willing to listen. Sergeant Henley, the final truth. They agreed to split up the next day. Henley would take the ledger and backup files to an independent MP, sympathetic to cold case victims. Morrow would leak selected pages to a major UK news outlet under protection of source anonymity, but they never made it. At dawn, Henley's flat was raided. not by police, by men in suits, claiming jurisdiction under the Official Secrets Act. The ledger was seized, his backups wiped. Mara's apartment was similarly stripped. All evidence vanished within hours. For weeks they heard nothing. Then the letters arrived. Quiet settlements, non-disclosure agreements, threats wrapped in legal language. The message was clear: let it die or join the disappeared. Mara refused. She published what she could remember: names, dates, fragments. It circulated online briefly, before being scrubbed from every platform. Labeled conspiracy theory, dismissed as rural legend. Henley tried one last time. He contacted a documentary producer, willing to go underground. They met in secret, exchanged files, planned the exposure. 3 days later, the producer's car went off a bridge. Accidental death. The coroner said. That's when Henley understood. This wasn't just a village secret. It was woven into the fabric of power itself, protected not by silence, but by design. He left England in 2008, changed his name, settled somewhere quiet, but before he disappeared, he left one final message, buried in a safety deposit box in Edinburgh, to be opened only after his death. Inside was a single page, a list of 12 names, members of parliament, judiciary, clergy, all connected, all protected, all aware. And at the bottom, written in his own hand, the Higgins family was not the last, and it will not stop unless someone with more courage than I exposes the rot at the root. Sergeant Len Henley died in 2019. Natural causes, they said. The box was never opened. St. Mary's Church still stands in Ashworth, restored, repainted, welcoming. The village thrives now, quaint and picturesque, a favorite of weekend tourists. But locals know better. They don't go near the old oak trees at dusk. They don't ask about the Higgins family. And every decade, without fail, someone new moves into the village. Someone with children. Someone who doesn't ask too many questions. Because some offerings are not one-time events. They are agreements, contracts written in blood, renewed in silence. And the soil beneath Ashworth is always, always hungry.